That night my ex-husband came back, he looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically smaller, though the expensive suits were gone, replaced by a wrinkled gray jacket that hung loosely from his shoulders. It was something else. Something in the way he stood on my porch, hands tucked awkwardly into his pockets like a boy who had broken a window. For a moment I didn't recognize him. Then he lifted his eyes, and 22 years of memories rushed back into my chest like cold water. "Linda," he said softly. The sound of my name in his voice still had the power to shake something loose inside me. Behind me, the house was warm with the smell of cinnamon tea and the quiet hum of the dishwasher. My little living room lamp cast a soft amber glow through the doorway. It was a peaceful house. A peaceful life. A life he had walked away from 2 years earlier. I leaned against the doorframe and studied him carefully. "Why are you here, Mark?" He swallowed. His eyes moved past me into the house as if searching for something familiar. Our old photographs, the blue rug we bought on vacation in Maine, the sound of laughter that used to fill these walls. But those things were gone now, just like he had been. I didn't know where else to go," he said. The words came out thin, fragile. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. A cold October wind rustled the maple tree in my front yard. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. I noticed then that Mark's car wasn't in the driveway. In fact, there was no car at all. He must have taken a bus. That realization settled over me slowly. 2 years earlier, he had left this house with a brand new convertible and a woman who was nearly 20 years younger than me. Now he stood on my porch with nothing but a tired expression and a plastic grocery bag hanging from one hand. Inside it, I could see a folded shirt. Maybe two. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. I let out a slow breath. The words floated between us like smoke. Sorry. It was such a small word for what had happened. For 20 years of marriage. For the night he looked me in the eye and told me he wanted a fresh start. For the way my world had collapsed while he drove away with someone else in the passenger seat. I crossed my arms. You should probably say that to someone who still believes you. Mark lowered his head. For the first time since he arrived, I noticed the gray creeping through his hair. He looked older. Life had a way of doing that. And standing there in the quiet glow of my porch light, I realized something strange. The man I once cried over was now just a stranger asking for shelter. But before I could decide what to do, my mind slipped backward, to the last time I had seen him before tonight. Back to the beginning of the end. 2 years earlier, my life had been ordinary in the best possible way. Mark and I lived in a modest 2-story house in Columbus, Ohio. Nothing fancy. Just a brick home with a wide front porch and a backyard big enough for summer barbecues. After 20 years of marriage, routine had become its own kind of comfort. Every morning, Mark would wake up before me and make coffee. I could always tell when it was ready because the smell drifted down the hallway and curled gently under the bedroom door. He wasn't a romantic man, but he had small habits that felt like love, like warming my mug before pouring the coffee, or leaving the sports section folded neatly beside my breakfast plate, because he knew I liked the crossword puzzle. Our daughter Emily had moved to Chicago the year before for graduate school, so it was just the two of us at home now. The quiet took some getting used to, but we managed. On Sundays, Mark grilled steaks while I made potato salad the way my mother taught me. Extra mustard, a little paprika sprinkled on top. Sometimes our neighbor Harold would wander over with a 6-pack of beer and sit at the picnic table telling the same fishing stories he'd told for 15 years. Life wasn't exciting, but it felt steady, solid. And after 2 decades together, I believed Mark and I had built something that couldn't be shaken easily. Looking back now, I realized that was the first mistake. Not trusting him, but believing life was immune to sudden change. The truth is, cracks rarely appear all at once. They start quietly, like a faint sound behind a wall. At first, you tell yourself it's nothing. Just the house settling. Just the wind. Just your imagination. The first change I noticed in Mark was small enough to ignore. It started with his phone. For years, Mark had treated his phone like any other household object. He'd leave it on the kitchen counter, on the coffee table, sometimes even in the bathroom. But one evening while we were watching television, I saw him slip it into his pocket when he stood up to get a drink. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the way he checked it. Quickly, secretively, like someone making sure they hadn't been caught. I remember thinking it was strange, but not strange enough to mention. Marriage teaches you to overlook little things. A few nights later, the phone buzzed again while we were eating dinner. Mark glanced at the screen. Then he flipped it over. "Work," he said casually. I nodded and passed him the salt. But I noticed he didn't check the message until he left the room. Again, I told myself it was nothing. Mark worked as a regional sales manager for a construction supply company. His job involved late calls, long drives, and sometimes unpredictable schedules. So when he started coming home later than usual, I didn't question it. At least not right away. Instead, I did what most wives do when something feels slightly off. I adjusted. Dinner moved from 6:30 to 7. Then sometimes 8. He said a new client was demanding more meetings. I believed him. After all, why wouldn't I? 20 years of marriage builds a kind of quiet trust. The kind that doesn't ask too many questions. The kind that assumes tomorrow will look a lot like yesterday. But slowly, almost invisibly, things began to shift. Mark started buying new clothes. Not just a shirt here and there. Entire outfits. Slim-cut jackets. Shoes that looked far too stylish for the man who once wore the same pair of sneakers for 5 years. One afternoon I teased him about it. Trying to impress someone? I laughed. He smiled. But it wasn't the same easy smile I'd known for 2 decades. It was tighter. Almost rehearsed. "Just trying to keep up with the younger guys at work," he said. At the time, the explanation sounded reasonable. But there was something else I couldn't quite name. Something in the air between us. A thin layer of distance. Like a door that had quietly closed. And I was standing on the wrong side of it. That was the moment the story truly began. Though at the time, I had no idea my life was about to split into 2 parts. The years before Mark left. And everything that came after. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if the human heart notices danger long before the mind is ready to accept it. Because something inside me had already started whispering that things were changing. I just didn't want to listen. Mark had always been a creature of habit. The kind of man who ordered the same meal at every restaurant and parked in the exact same spot at the grocery store, even when there were closer ones available. Routine made him comfortable. So when that routine began shifting, it felt unsettling. At first it was just small things. He started going to the gym. Now there's nothing unusual about a man wanting to stay healthy. But Mark had spent 20 years insisting that lifting grocery bags counted as exercise. Suddenly he had a membership at a new fitness center across town. "Doctor said my cholesterol's creeping up," he explained one evening while tying brand new running shoes. I nodded. It sounded responsible. Still, I remember watching him that night as he stood in the hallway mirror adjusting the collar of a fitted athletic shirt. He studied himself longer than usual, turning slightly, checking the way the fabric sat across his shoulders. When he caught me looking, he smiled. "Trying to keep the old engine running," he joked. But the joke didn't quite land. Not because it was strange, but because something about the way he said it felt like he was speaking to someone else. Over the next few weeks, the gym became part of his routine. 3 nights a week. Then 4. Sometimes he'd come home smelling like unfamiliar cologne mixed with the sharp scent of disinfectant wipes gyms always seem to have. Once I asked casually, "Since when do they spray perfume at the gym?" He laughed. "Probably someone else in the locker room." Again, reasonable. Always reasonable. The mind is very good at finding explanations when the heart is afraid of the truth. Our daughter Emily called one Sunday afternoon while Mark was out. I was sitting at the kitchen table peeling apples for a pie. "How's Dad?" she asked. I shrugged even though she couldn't see me. "Busy with work. New clients." She hesitated. "Mom, he didn't answer my text this week." That's not unusual," I said lightly. "You know your father and phones." Emily laughed softly. "True." Then she changed the subject to her classes and a professor who assigned far too much reading. But after we hung up, I sat there staring at the apple slices in the bowl. Because Emily was right about one thing. Mark might not answer messages quickly, but he always answered his daughter. Always. Still, I pushed the thought away. Marriage teaches you patience. It teaches you not to jump to conclusions. And most of all, it teaches you to protect the peace you've built. A few weeks later, the first real moment of doubt arrived. It happened on a Wednesday evening. Mark had told me he'd be late again because of a meeting with a contractor from Dayton. I remember the exact moment, because I had just taken a casserole out of the oven. Steam rose from the dish, filling the kitchen with the smell of melted cheese and roasted tomatoes. The clock on the microwave said 8:17 p.m. I was covering the dish with foil when Mark's phone buzzed on the counter. He had forgotten it. That alone was unusual. Lately the phone had been glued to him like an extra limb. For a moment, I ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. 3 times in less than 10 seconds. Something about the urgency made me glance at the screen. Just a quick look. Not snooping. Just curiosity. The message preview lit up across the lock screen. Can't stop thinking about tonight, red heart K. My hand froze. The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. I stared at the screen for a long time. Long enough for the light to fade back to black. I remember standing there, dish towel still in my hand, telling myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe Kay was a client. Maybe it was someone thanking him for dinner. Maybe, but deep down, a cold feeling had already settled into my chest. The kind of feeling that doesn't come from imagination. It comes from recognition. Still, I did what so many people do when faced with something they're not ready to confront. I put the phone back exactly where it had been. Then I sat down at the table and waited. Mark came home around 9:30. He looked tired but oddly energized at the same time. Like someone who had been laughing recently. "Sorry I'm late," he said, loosening his tie. "Meeting ran long." I nodded toward the casserole dish. "I kept dinner warm." He washed his hands and joined me at the table. For a few minutes we ate in comfortable silence. Then he reached into his pocket suddenly. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. "Where's my phone?" "It rang earlier," I said calmly. "You left it on the counter." He stood up quickly to grab it. Too quickly. I watched him read the screen. For a split second, something flashed across his expression. Alarm. Then it disappeared. "Work stuff," he muttered. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and continued eating. Neither of us mentioned it again. But that night, as I lay awake beside him listening to the quiet rhythm of his breathing, the message kept repeating in my mind. "Can't stop thinking about tonight." And the small red heart beside it. That was the moment suspicion truly entered our marriage. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet question that refused to leave. And once a question like that appears, it changes the way you see everything. The way he smiled at his phone. The sudden gym visits. The new clothes. The late meetings. All the small things I had ignored were starting to form a pattern. Still, I wasn't ready to say the word out loud. Not yet. Because the moment you say it, the moment you admit that the person you trusted most in the world might be lying, your entire life begins to tremble. And at that point, I was still hoping I was wrong. After that message appeared on Mark's phone, something inside me changed. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just enough to make me start paying closer attention. It's strange how quickly ordinary things begin to look different once doubt slips into the room. The same kitchen table where we had shared thousands of quiet meals suddenly felt like a place where two strangers were politely pretending to be comfortable. Mark continued with his routine. Gym. Work. Late meetings. But now I noticed details that had once passed quietly by. The way he smiled at his phone while walking down the hallway. The way he angled the screen away from me when messages popped up. The way he started stepping outside to take certain calls. One evening I was folding laundry in the living room when his phone buzzed again. He was in the shower. The sound echoed across the coffee table. Just one buzz. Then silence. I stared at the phone longer than I want to admit. There it was. The same object that had sat openly in our home for 2 decades. Now it felt like a locked door. For a moment curiosity tugged at me. I could pick it up. I could look. But another voice inside me whispered something else. If you look, you might find something you can't unsee. So I kept folding laundry. When Mark came downstairs, he picked up the phone almost immediately. Another new habit. He checked the screen, then slipped it into his pocket. Everything okay? I asked casually. Yeah, he said. Just work. That answer was beginning to sound like background noise. Always the same. Always easy. And yet somehow less believable every time. A week later, something else happened. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was cleaning out the hallway closet. Mark had gone to the gym earlier that morning. He said he might grab lunch with a coworker afterward. So I expected him to be gone for a few hours. The closet was full of things that accumulate over time. Old board games, winter coats, a box of Emily's childhood drawings. I was moving a stack of shoes when I noticed something unfamiliar on the top shelf. A small paper shopping bag. Inside it was a receipt. And underneath the receipt, a delicate gold bracelet. Elegant. Definitely not mine. For a moment, I just stood there holding it. The bracelet sparkled softly in the afternoon light coming through the hallway window. I turned it over in my hand. There was a small engraving on the inside. K. The same letter from the message. My stomach tightened. Still, my mind kept reaching for explanations. Maybe it was a gift for someone at work. Maybe a retirement present. Maybe, but deep down, that cold feeling returned. The same one that had settled in my chest when I saw the message on his phone. I placed the bracelet back in the bag exactly how I had found it. Then I closed the closet door. Sometimes the mind protects itself by postponing the truth. That evening Mark came home cheerful. Too cheerful. He brought takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant and set the containers on the kitchen counter like a peace offering. Thought we could do something easy tonight, he said. I watched him carefully. Good workout? I asked. Great, he said, feeling stronger already. He moved around the kitchen with easy confidence, humming softly while opening the food containers. If he felt guilty, he hid it well. We sat down at the table and began eating. Halfway through dinner I spoke. Casually. Mark, I said, did you buy a bracelet recently? His chopsticks froze midair. Just for a second. Then he continued eating. Oh, he said lightly. Yeah. For a client's wife. Anniversary gift. I nodded slowly. That's thoughtful. Dash company relationship stuff, he said. You know how it is. I did know. And that was exactly the problem. Because in 20 years of marriage, Mark had never bought jewelry for a client's wife. Not once. Still, I didn't argue. Not yet. Because confronting someone before you have the full truth is like stepping into fog. You can't see where you're going. And I wasn't ready to walk blindly into whatever this was becoming. Over the next few weeks, the distance between us grew. Not dramatically, just subtly. Like two people slowly drifting apart on opposite sides of a lake. Mark spent more time away from home. More late meetings. More client dinners. Sometimes he came home after midnight. Other nights he slept in the guest room, claiming he didn't want to wake me. One evening Emily called again. Mom, she said carefully, is everything okay with you and Dad? The question surprised me. What makes you ask that? Dash, I don't know, she said. He just seems different lately. I hesitated. Because the truth was, I didn't know how to answer. Finally I said, your father's just busy right now. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. You deserve better than busy, Mom. After we hung up, I sat alone in the living room. The house felt unusually quiet that night. Mark was out again. Another meeting. Another client. Another explanation that floated through the air like smoke. That was the night I began to accept something I had been avoiding. The changes weren't random. They weren't temporary. They weren't misunderstandings. They were pieces of something much larger. And whatever that larger thing was, it was slowly pulling my marriage apart. Still, I hadn't seen the full truth yet. Not the kind of truth that breaks a life into two halves. That moment was coming soon. And when it arrived, nothing in my world would ever look the same again. The truth finally arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Not with shouting. Not with drama. Just a quiet moment that changed everything. I remember the sound of rain tapping against the kitchen window while I was making tea. The sky had that heavy gray color that settles over Ohio in early spring, The kind of weather that makes the whole world feel slow. Mark had texted earlier that morning saying he'd be traveling to Dayton again for meetings. He said he wouldn't be home until late. By that point, those messages barely registered anymore. They had become part of the routine. But around 3 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Harold, our neighbor. "Linda," he said, sounding confused. "I just saw Mark downtown." My hand tightened slightly around the mug. "Downtown?" I asked. "Yeah. Over near Riverside Park." That made no sense. Riverside Park was nearly an hour away from the direction Mark would take to reach Dayton. "He must be meeting someone," I said carefully. Harold chuckled. "Well, looks like he already met her." The words hung in the air for a moment. "Her?" I asked quietly. Harold hesitated, realizing perhaps that he had stepped into something he didn't understand. "Oh, I just assumed you knew. He's sitting at that little cafe by the river. With a young woman." Young woman. 2 simple words. But they landed in my chest like a stone. Harold continued awkwardly. "Maybe it's business or something. I didn't want to bother you, but I thought I'd say hello when I saw him and he seemed surprised." I thanked him for the call and hung up. For several minutes, I stood there in the kitchen. The tea had gone cold in my hand. My mind began moving through possibilities. Clients, co-workers, friends. But something inside me already knew. That cold recognition again. The same one that had appeared with the bracelet. The same one that had followed the late-night messages. Without fully thinking it through, I grabbed my coat and car keys. The drive to Riverside Park took 40 minutes. 40 minutes where my mind kept jumping between hope and dread. Maybe Harold misunderstood. Maybe it really was a work meeting. Maybe, but when I pulled into the parking lot near the cafe, I saw Mark's car immediately. The silver convertible was parked near the sidewalk, glistening with rain. I parked across the street. For a moment, I sat there gripping the steering wheel. The cafe windows were fogged slightly from the warmth inside. Through the glass, I could see people talking, laughing, sipping coffee. Then I saw him. Mark sat at a small table near the window. Across from him was a woman. She looked young. Early 30s, maybe. Long dark hair. Bright red sweater. She was leaning forward slightly, laughing at something he had said. And Mark. Mark looked happier than I had seen him in months. Maybe longer. The kind of relaxed smile that used to belong to me. My chest tightened. For a moment, I thought about leaving. Just driving home and pretending I had never seen it. But something deeper pushed me out of the car. I crossed the street slowly. The rain had started falling harder now, tapping softly against the pavement. When I reached the cafe door, I paused. Then I stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed gently. Mark looked up. And the moment our eyes met, his smile disappeared. The woman turned to see what had caught his attention. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then I walked toward the table. "Hi, Mark." My voice surprised me. It sounded calm, almost casual. He stood quickly, knocking his chair slightly against the floor. "Linda, what are you doing here?" I could ask you the same thing." His mouth opened, then closed again. The woman looked between us with growing confusion. Mark cleared his throat. "Linda, this is Kara," she said suddenly, extending her hand toward me with a polite smile. "Nice to meet you." The name landed like thunder in my head. K. The bracelet. The message. All the scattered pieces suddenly aligned. I looked at her hand but didn't take it. Instead, I looked back at Mark. "How long?" I asked quietly. Mark's face drained of color. "Linda, this isn't the place. How long?" The cafe had grown quiet around us. People were beginning to notice. Kara shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Finally, Mark spoke. "A few months." I stared at him. "A few months," I repeated slowly. The words echoed in my mind against 20 years of marriage. 20 years reduced to a few careless months. Kara looked at Mark nervously. "You told me she knew," she whispered. My eyes snapped toward her. "Knew what?" Mark rubbed his forehead. "Kara, please." But the damage was already done. Her expression changed. Confusion giving way to realization. "You didn't tell her?" she asked sharply. Mark said nothing. The silence answered the question. And in that moment, something inside me broke completely. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, final crack in the foundation of everything I thought my life was. I looked at Mark one last time. Then I said the only thing that felt honest. 20 years, I said softly. And this is how it ends. Then I turned and walked out of the cafe. The rain was falling harder now, but I barely noticed, because the truth had finally arrived. And there was no going back. The rain followed me all the way back to the car. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I simply walked across the wet pavement, as if my legs had already decided what to do before my mind could catch up. Once inside the car, I closed the door and sat there for a long moment. The windshield blurred under the steady rhythm of rain. My hands rested on the steering wheel, but I didn't start the engine. Inside my chest, something felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just empty. After 20 years with someone, you imagine that discovering betrayal would feel explosive. You imagine shouting, accusations, dramatic confrontations. But the truth is much quieter. It feels like the slow collapse of a building you didn't realize was already cracking. I stared through the rain at the cafe window. Mark was still standing beside the table, talking urgently to Kara. Then he looked toward the street, toward my car. For a second, I thought he might come outside. But he didn't. Instead, he sat back down. And that was the moment I understood something very clearly. I was no longer the center of his world. I started the engine. The drive home felt longer than before. Every streetlight seemed to stretch the distance between the life I had known that morning and the one I was driving into now. When I reached the house, the porch light glowed warmly against the darkness. The same light Mark and I had installed together years earlier. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly like the lemon cleaner I had used earlier that day. Everything looked exactly the same. The couch, the family photos, Emily's graduation picture hanging near the staircase. Yet the house felt different now, like a stage after the actors have left. I walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table. For the first time since leaving the cafe, the tears finally came. Not loud sobbing, just quiet tears sliding down my face as the truth settled fully into place. Mark had been living a second life, and I had been the last person to know. Mark came home around 9 that night. I heard the car pull into the driveway. The front door opened slowly. "Linda," he called. I was still sitting at the kitchen table, the same place where we had shared thousands of meals together. He walked in cautiously, like someone entering unfamiliar territory. His hair was damp from the rain. He looked tired, but there was also something else in his eyes. Guilt, fear, maybe even relief that the secret was finally out. He stood across the table from me for a moment before speaking. "I was going to tell you." The sentence hung awkwardly in the air. I looked up at him. "When?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know, soon." I let out a soft breath. That's the interesting thing about lies, Mark. There's always a plan to tell the truth someday. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he said her name. "Kara." "Yes," I said quietly. "I've heard it before." He looked at the table. "We met about 6 months ago." "Dash at the gym?" I asked. His eyes flickered up. Then he nodded. "Yeah." The simplicity of the answer made my chest tighten. 6 months. 6 months of secrets, messages, late nights, and lies. "And the bracelet?" I asked. He hesitated. "For her birthday." "Of course it was." I folded my hands together on the table. "So what happens now?" Mark leaned back in the chair and exhaled heavily. For a moment he looked like the man I had spent 20 years with. The man who once fixed our broken sink at midnight and drove 3 hours to pick Emily up from college when she was homesick. But that man felt very far away now. "I didn't plan for this to happen," he said. "That's what people always say." "Dash, I mean it," he insisted. Things between us had gotten quiet. I stared at him. Quiet. He shifted uncomfortably. We just stopped being exciting. There it was. The word that people use when they want to justify destroying something stable. Exciting. I laughed softly. "Mark, we built a life together. Lives aren't supposed to be exciting every day. They're supposed to be dependable. He ran his hands through his hair. Kara makes me feel young again. The honesty of that sentence cut deeper than any lie. And what does she know about you? I asked quietly. He frowned. What do you mean? Dash. Does she know you forget where you put your keys every morning? That you snore so loudly the dog used to leave the room? That you cry during old war movies? He looked away. Because Kara didn't know those things. Those details belonged to the life we had built together. A life he had decided was too ordinary. After a long silence, he spoke again. I want to try something different. The words felt strangely formal. Like a business proposal. I nodded slowly. You mean you want to leave? He didn't argue. And in that moment, the marriage that had lasted 2 decades came to its quiet end. No screaming. No broken dishes. Just 2 people sitting at a kitchen table realizing that the life they built together had reached its final page. Mark moved out 3 days later. He packed quickly. Clothes. Shoes. A few boxes of personal things. He left most of the furniture behind. On his last night in the house, he stood in the doorway holding his car keys. I never wanted to hurt you, he said. I looked at him calmly. Yet here we are. He hesitated. Then he said the sentence that would echo in my mind for years. I just want a fresh start. A fresh start. As if 20 years could be erased like chalk from a blackboard. I watched him walk down the driveway and climb into his car. The engine started. The headlights swept across the front yard. Then he drove away. And just like that, my marriage was over. But what Mark didn't realize in that moment, what neither of us could possibly see yet, was that the story wasn't finished. Not even close. Because 2 years later, the man who left for a fresh start would return to this very porch. With nothing. The morning after Mark left, the house felt painfully quiet. Not the peaceful quiet I had grown used to after Emily moved away. This was a different kind of silence. The kind that settles into a place when something important has been removed. I woke up earlier than usual, even though there was no reason to rush. For 20 years, my mornings had followed a rhythm built around Mark's routine. Coffee brewing at 6, the morning news murmuring softly in the background, the clink of his spoon against the mug as he stirred in sugar. But that morning, there was only stillness. I walked into the kitchen and made coffee for one. The smell filled the room, warm and familiar, but something about it felt off. Like hearing a favorite song played too slowly. I sat at the kitchen table with the mug in both hands and stared out the window at the backyard. The grass was damp from the night's rain. The maple tree Mark planted when Emily was 10 swayed gently in the morning breeze. 20 years of life had unfolded in that yard. Birthday parties, barbecues, family arguments that always ended in laughter. Now it all felt like someone else's memories. My phone buzzed softly on the table. It was Emily. Dad told me. Are you okay? I stared at the message for a moment before answering. I will be. A few seconds later she called. Mom. Her voice was tight with concern. I'm here. I said gently. I can't believe he did this, she said. After everything. I leaned back in my chair. People make choices, sweetheart. Dash, that's not a choice. That's selfish. I didn't argue. Because she wasn't wrong. But anger had never been a language I spoke well. Instead I said, your father thinks he's starting a new chapter. Emily scoffed. With someone who's barely older than me. That detail still felt strange even in my own mind. Kara was 32. Mark was 52. But age gaps weren't really the issue. The real issue was the life he had abandoned to chase something that felt exciting again. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised me. Come visit Chicago for a while. I smiled faintly. That's sweet of you, but I think I need to stay here. Dash, why? I looked around the kitchen. The house held sadness, yes. But it also held 20 years of strength. This is still my home, I said softly. The first few months after the separation were strange. Not dramatic. Just unfamiliar. Every routine had to be rewritten. I learned which bills Mark had been paying automatically. I rearranged the closet so half the empty space wouldn't stare back at me every morning. I donated several of his old jackets to a local shelter. At first, The neighbors were polite but curious. Small towns have a way of noticing when things change. Harold stopped by one afternoon while I was trimming the bushes. Heard Mark moved out, he said carefully. I wiped my hands on my gardening gloves. Yes. He nodded slowly. Well, if you ever need help fixing anything around here, just knock on my door. I appreciated the kindness, even if it came wrapped in the quiet curiosity of neighborhood gossip. Over time, people learned the truth. Not because I spread the story, but because stories like that always find their way through a community. Mark had left his wife for a younger woman. Simple, direct, embarrassing. But strangely, I didn't feel humiliated the way I once imagined I might. Instead, I felt something else. Clarity. Mark's choice had nothing to do with my worth. It had everything to do with his restlessness. And restlessness has a way of leading people down roads they don't fully understand. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I began changing things in the house. Not major renovations, just small adjustments that made the space feel like mine again. I painted the living room a soft warm beige instead of the dark green Mark had always preferred. I moved the furniture around. I replaced the heavy curtains with lighter ones that let more sunlight in. One Saturday morning while rearranging the bookshelf, I realized something unexpected. For the first time in months, I felt peaceful. Not happy exactly, but steady. The kind of steadiness that grows slowly after a storm passes. Emily noticed the difference when she visited during Thanksgiving. She walked into the living room and looked around with surprise. "Mom," she said, smiling, "this place looks different." I laughed. "Different good or different strange?" "Different strong," she said. That word stayed with me. Strong. Because the truth was, I had survived something that once felt impossible. The end of a marriage. The collapse of a life I thought was permanent. And yet here I was. Still standing. Still building something new. Meanwhile, Mark seemed to disappear from my daily life completely. I heard occasional updates through mutual friends. He had moved into a downtown apartment. Kara had moved in with him not long after. They traveled a lot. Restaurants, concerts, weekend trips. The kind of life that looked exciting on social media. At first those updates stung slightly. Not because I wanted him back, but because 20 years together had created a long shadow. Still, that feeling faded faster than I expected. Because the truth is, once someone walks out of your life willingly, you eventually learn to stop watching the door. And for nearly 2 years, I never heard from Mark again. Not a call. Not a message. Not even a holiday greeting. Until the night he returned to my porch. Older, tired, and completely alone. For nearly 2 years after Mark left, I didn't see him once. Life moved forward the way it always does. Quietly, steadily, without asking anyone's permission. The seasons changed. Spring softened the yard with new green leaves. Summer brought long evenings on the porch with a book and a glass of iced tea. Autumn scattered orange and gold across the maple tree Mark had planted years earlier. At first, I expected memories of him to linger everywhere. But something surprising happened instead. The house slowly stopped feeling like our home. It became mine. I rearranged rooms the way I wanted. I turned Mark's old office into a small reading space with a comfortable armchair near the window. I filled shelves with books I had always meant to read, but never had time for. On Saturday mornings, I drove to the farmer's market downtown and bought fresh bread and flowers. Simple things, quiet things, but they built a rhythm that belonged entirely to me. Emily visited often during that time. Sometimes she stayed for a week, working remotely from the dining room table, while I cooked dinners the way I always had when she was growing up. One evening while we were washing dishes together, she said something that made me pause. "You know, Dad doesn't seem as happy as he pretends." I turned off the faucet. "You've seen him?" She nodded. "Once. At a coffee shop near my office in Chicago. He was there with Kara." And Emily dried her hands with a towel. "He looked tired." I considered that quietly. "People get tired," I said. She studied my face carefully. "You don't miss him, do you?" The question wasn't accusatory, just curious. I thought about it honestly. "I miss the man I married," I said. But I'm not sure that man still exists. Emily nodded slowly. Sometimes children understand more than we expect. Around the same time, the first real piece of news about Mark's fresh start reached me. It came from Harold, of course. Our neighbor had always had a talent for hearing things before anyone else. He stopped by one afternoon while I was watering the front garden. "Ran into your ex-husband downtown yesterday," he said casually. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, didn't look like things were going great." Harold leaned against the fence. Apparently the company he worked for laid off half their regional managers. My watering can paused midair. "And Mark was one of them?" Harold nodded. "Company restructuring." I set the watering can down slowly. Mark had spent nearly 25 years building that career. Sales had always been his pride, his identity in many ways. "What's he doing now?" I asked. Harold shrugged. "Not sure. But from what I heard, the apartment downtown wasn't cheap." That detail lingered in my mind after Harold left. Because I knew Mark. He had always lived comfortably, but never extravagantly. Without that job, things might get complicated quickly. Still, his choices were no longer my responsibility. So I returned to my garden and finished watering the flowers. A few months later, another update arrived. This time from Emily. She called one evening sounding unusually thoughtful. "Mom," she said carefully, "I talked to Dad today." That alone was surprising. Mark hadn't reached out to either of us in a long time. "How is he?" I asked. Emily hesitated. "I think things are falling apart." She explained that Mark had been struggling to find another position. At 54, companies were less interested in hiring someone who once managed teams, but now had no active accounts. The job market had changed faster than he expected. "What about Kara?" I asked. Emily sighed. "That's the other part." Apparently Kara had been working part-time at a marketing firm. But after Mark lost his income, the lifestyle they had built together became harder to maintain. Trips stopped. Restaurants became rare. Bills piled up. "Dad said they've been arguing a lot," Emily said. I wasn't surprised. Relationships built on excitement often struggle when ordinary life arrives. "Are they still together?" I asked. "For now." Emily paused. Then she added quietly, "But it doesn't sound like the fairy tale he imagined." I stared out the window toward the backyard. The maple tree leaves rustled gently in the evening breeze. For a moment, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Just a quiet understanding of how life tends to correct its own imbalances. When people chase something new believing it will erase their unhappiness, they often discover that unhappiness travels with them. Nearly a year passed after that conversation. I continued living my life. Volunteering at the community library, visiting Emily in Chicago, taking long walks through Riverside Park on Sunday mornings. Gradually, the story of my marriage became something I thought about less and less. Until one autumn night. The wind was colder than usual, carrying the dry rustle of falling leaves. I had just finished making tea when the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house unexpectedly. It was nearly 9 o'clock. Most visitors in our neighborhood came earlier in the evening. I walked to the door slowly. When I opened it, there he was. Mark. Standing under the porch light. Looking older, thinner, and far more uncertain than the man who had driven away 2 years earlier. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "Linda, can we talk?" And just like that, the past had returned to my doorstep. The wind carried the smell of fallen leaves across the porch. For a moment, neither of us moved. Mark stood under the yellow glow of the porch light, shoulders slightly hunched, the collar of his worn jacket pulled up against the cold. 2 years. 2 full years had passed since I last saw him. And yet standing there, he looked both familiar and strangely distant. Like a photograph of someone I used to know. "I didn't expect you," I said calmly. Mark nodded, almost as if he had rehearsed that moment in his mind many times before arriving. "I know." His voice was softer than I remembered. Less confident. He shifted his weight awkwardly. "I wouldn't be here if I had another option." I crossed my arms lightly. That sentence told me more than anything else he could have said. "Where's Kara?" I asked. The name seemed to hit him harder than the cold wind. He looked down at the porch floor for a moment. She left. The answer came quickly, like something he had been forced to repeat to himself already. I waited. When people come back after a long silence, they usually bring a story with them. Sure enough, Mark exhaled slowly. It's been a rough year. I didn't invite him inside. Not yet. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe and listened. He rubbed his hands together nervously. You heard about my job? I heard something. Company downsized. I thought I'd find something else quickly. He shook his head. Turns out companies don't rush to hire men in their 50s. There was no bitterness in his voice, just exhaustion. What about savings? I asked. Went faster than I expected. The words were blunt, honest. Then he added quietly, Kara wasn't interested in sticking around when things got tight. That part didn't surprise me. Some relationships grow stronger under pressure. Others collapse the moment life stops feeling exciting. Mark gave a small, humorless laugh. She said she didn't sign up for this version of me. I studied his face carefully. There were deeper lines around his eyes now, gray threaded through his hair. He looked like a man who had spent too many nights lying awake with worries he couldn't solve. And now? I asked. He hesitated. Then he held up the small plastic grocery bag I had noticed earlier. I'm staying at a cheap motel right now. The wind rattled the porch railing. I said nothing. Mark swallowed. Linda, I know I have no right to ask you for anything. Finally, we had reached the real reason he had come. But I was hoping, he continued carefully, maybe we could talk. I looked past him toward the quiet street. A few porch lights glowed in neighboring houses. People living their ordinary lives, unaware of the strange circle my own life had just completed. What exactly do you want to talk about? I asked. He met my eyes. Us. The word felt heavy in the air. For a moment, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of the sheer irony. You left 2 years ago, Mark, I said gently. There hasn't been an us for a long time. I know. His voice cracked slightly, but I made a mistake. There it was. The sentence people always say when reality catches up with their choices. I thought starting over would fix everything, he continued. I thought I needed something new. And now? I asked. Now I realize I threw away the best thing I ever had. The words might have meant something once. Years ago. Before the lies. Before the cafe. Before the quiet destruction of a marriage. But now they felt like echoes arriving too late. Mark looked past me into the house. The warm light from the living room spilled across the hallway floor. I miss this place, he said softly. I followed his gaze. The house had changed since he left. New curtains. Different furniture. Small details that slowly transformed the space into something entirely mine. You don't miss the house, I said calmly. You miss the stability. He didn't argue. Instead, he said something surprisingly honest. I miss the person who believed in me. For a moment, silence settled between us again. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. Is there any chance we could start over? The wind rustled the maple tree in the yard. Leaves drifted softly across the driveway. I looked at the man standing on my porch. The man who once promised to spend the rest of his life with me. The man who walked away for something more exciting. And now stood here asking for the past to return. But life doesn't move backward. Not really. Still, I opened the door a little wider. Come in, I said. Mark stepped inside slowly, almost cautiously, like someone entering a place filled with fragile memories. He looked around the living room. It's different, he said. Yes, I replied. Because it was. Everything was. And what happened next would decide the final chapter of our story. Once Mark stepped inside, I gestured toward the living room. Sit, I said, pointing to the armchair I had claimed as my own space over the past 2 years. He lowered himself slowly, still carrying that nervous tension, like a man who had been living with constant uncertainty for months. We sat in silence for a few moments. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I didn't come here to argue, he began. I wanted to see you. To explain. I let him speak because listening was part of this now. Over the past 2 years, I had learned something important. Hearing someone out doesn't mean you forgive them. It simply means you understand. Mark spoke quietly, almost like he was talking to himself. I was foolish. I thought the grass was greener. I didn't see how much I had until it was gone. Kara, she wasn't me. She never knew our life. She never knew what it meant to have a family, to build a home, to love someone every day. I nodded slowly, absorbing his words. They were exciting months, I said softly. At first, I think that's why it seemed worth it to you. But excitement doesn't sustain a marriage. Mark's gaze dropped to the carpet. Yes, he admitted. I see that now. I felt the familiar ache rise in my chest. Not anger, exactly. Not resentment. Just a hollow sadness that comes from realizing that love and choices sometimes move in opposite directions. So what now? I asked quietly. Why are you here? He looked up, eyes tired but earnest. I don't know. I thought maybe I could apologize. Properly. Not through messages, not through half-truths, not through silence. I nodded. That part one could respect. I accept your apology, I said. But there are things we can't undo. And there are boundaries I won't cross. Mark listened carefully. I understand, he said. Good, I replied. Because part of moving forward is recognizing the consequences of your actions. You can't undo 2 years of choices. You can only move forward honestly from now. He nodded again. I'm broke, he admitted softly. Kara left. I lost my job. The apartment downtown. I can barely keep up. The words weren't dramatic. They were simply factual. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Not for Mark's suffering exactly, but for myself. For the fact that life had a way of balancing itself out. I can't fix your mistakes, I said gently. But I won't make your problems mine. You have to rebuild. Without me. He nodded slowly, as if the weight of that statement had finally reached him. Thank you, he said quietly. For listening. I smiled faintly. You need to learn the hard way. That's part of being human. Mark rose from the chair, looking exhausted but clearer than he had in years. I'll leave now, he said. I walked with him to the door. He paused, hand on the knob. Linda, I hope you're happy. I am, I said calmly. And I will be. You should try that too. Then he stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The porch light cast long shadows across the driveway. I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment. Inside, the living room felt warm and safe. The maple leaves rustled outside. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like the storm had passed. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't had in years. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon from the candle I had lit the night before. Emily called while I sipped my coffee. Mom, she asked brightly. How are you? I smiled. Better than I have been in a long time. I can tell, she said. You sound at peace. I am, I admitted. I finally feel like my life belongs to me again. We talked for a while about the little things. Her job, my new reading nook, the flowers in the garden. Simple things. Ordinary things. The kind of things that build a life worth living. After the call, I sat quietly by the window, watching the sunlight play across the walls. The maple tree swayed gently outside. And I realized something important. Happiness isn't found in the person who leaves you, or in revenge, or in excitement. It comes quietly, through the small decisions you make every day to keep living, to keep caring, to keep building. I had been betrayed. I had been abandoned. But I had survived. And that survival had taught me a truth far more valuable than anger or resentment. Strength comes not from clinging. It comes from letting go. Over the next few months, life settled into a new rhythm. I visited friends more often. I joined a book club at the library. Emily and I took a weekend trip to Chicago. The house no longer felt empty or haunted by the past. It felt lived in. It felt safe. And for the first time in years, I looked forward instead, not back. Mark never returned after that night on the porch. I heard occasional updates from Emily. He was still struggling to find stability. But I didn't watch him. I didn't need to. Because my life had grown full again, without him. I had learned that people who leave often return only to remind us of the value of what we had. But the real lesson is to live fully, regardless of their return. And that's what I did. Sitting here now, looking out the window at the maple tree in the backyard. I often think about that night 2 years ago when Mark first left. I remember the weight of the door closing behind him. The hollow quiet in the house that had once been filled with laughter, arguments, and ordinary chaos. The ache in my chest that felt like it would never ease. And yet here I am. The house smells of fresh bread from this morning. The sunlight glimmers off the coffee mug in my hands. And Emily's laughter still echoes through video calls. Life has continued. Life has grown. Life has filled the spaces I thought were lost forever. I have learned that life doesn't wait for us to be ready. It doesn't pause for betrayal, heartbreak, or regrets. It keeps moving, whether we are clinging to the past or embracing what comes next. I won't pretend the pain disappears completely. Some days I still think about Mark. The choices he made, the excitement he chased, the life he walked away from. But those thoughts no longer control me. They are just memories, like photographs tucked away in an old album. Because the truth is, survival isn't just about enduring. It's about building again. It's about reclaiming your life piece by piece, even when someone else tried to take it from you. It's about understanding that forgiveness is not about letting someone off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of anger. And yes, it's about realizing your own strength. I didn't need Mark to come back to teach me that lesson. I learned it while he was gone. I learned it while I painted new curtains, planted flowers in the garden, read books I'd been putting off, and allowed myself to laugh without worry. I learned it while I rebuilt my life slowly, quietly, but fully. Now, I sometimes wonder about Mark. I hope he has learned something too, about choices, consequences, and the cost of walking away from what truly matters. But more importantly, I know this about myself. I am whole. I am capable. I am enough. And that is a feeling no one can take from me. So, I leave you with this, whoever you are listening. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most return to remind us of what we had. Sometimes they leave, never to come back, and that teaches us an even greater lesson. The question isn't whether they will return. The question is, what will you do with your life while they are gone? Will you wait, or will you build? Will you cry, or will you rise? I chose to rise. And I promise you, if I could do it, so can you. Take your life back. Reclaim your peace. Build the happiness that no one else can give you. Because in the end, the person who walks away loses far more than the one who stays.